Hikers/park rangers of Reddit, what is the scariest/creepiest thing that you have seen in the woods? Serious. My wife, my dog, and I once went hiking in a national forest. The first couple of miles of the trail were pretty busy because they led to a popular waterfall and a swimming hole. Families and groups were gathered around the water, enjoying the scenery. After spending a little time there, we decided to keep going past the waterfall. Getting beyond it required a short but steep climb, just enough to discourage most hikers from continuing further. Once we made it over that section, the trail quickly became quiet. We walked another mile or two without seeing a single person. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves. Our dog was loving every second of it. She had endless energy and would happily walk 30 miles if we let her. She was sniffing everything, trotting ahead, and clearly enjoying being out in the woods. Then, in a particularly dense part of the trail, she suddenly stopped. She froze in place and stared straight ahead into the trees. No matter how much we tugged on the leash, she refused to move another inch forward. My wife and I stopped and listened carefully, trying to hear what might have caught her attention, but the forest was completely silent. We couldn't see anything unusual either. Our dog, however, started whining. She turned around and began pulling hard on the leash, trying to drag us back up the trail toward the swimming hole. I had never seen her act like that before, and I haven't since. She wasn't just hesitant, she was genuinely terrified of whatever might have been ahead of us. Maybe there was a bear further down the trail. Maybe a coyote was nearby. Or maybe something much worse was hiding out there in the woods. We never found out. We decided to trust our dog and turned around, hiking back as quickly as we could. To this day, I still wonder what she sensed that we couldn't. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe we unknowingly avoided something terrible deep in that forest. I used to work as a park ranger in the desert, and over the years I saw a few things that still stick with me. One time, volunteers from one of our parks called to report a car that was still smoking in a remote campsite. Unfortunately, it wasn't unusual for stolen cars to be dumped and burned out there, so we headed over to check it out. When we arrived, the car was still smoldering. We stood around for a few minutes, waiting for the fire department and looking it over from a distance. At first, it just seemed like another burned vehicle. Then, after staring at it a bit longer, it became painfully obvious there was a body sitting in the front seat. That realization changed the mood instantly. We started looking around the campsite and found all kinds of strange things scattered nearby: food wrappers, rope, and other items that didn't make much sense. It looked like whoever had been in the driver's seat had been tied up and shot. The police eventually arrived and handled the investigation, but as far as I know, they never figured out exactly what happened. These days we refer to that campsite as the haunted site. Ironically, it's now the most popular spot in that small park. Another incident involved a call that came into our office. A man had phoned in, threatening to kill himself. He claimed he had several guns and gave a location not far from our park. Two of my coworkers were sent out to check on it. By the time they arrived, another ranger agency had already found the scene. They told my coworkers to leave before they got dragged into a mountain of paperwork. Apparently, the man had already shot himself, though not immediately fatally, and had tried to walk for help afterward. The scene was messy. The worst part was that the ranger who found him had just gone through something terrible herself. Only a month earlier, her husband, also a ranger, had taken his own life, and she had been the one to find him. Walking into another scene like that must have been devastating. But the scariest experience I personally had was something much simpler. I had just moved to the area and was responsible for two parks that were both closed at the time. They were extremely remote, about 30 miles from the nearest occupied houses, and even those homes were often empty during the summer. One night, I decided to drive out to the darker of the two parks to watch a meteor shower. I also brought my banjo, figuring I'd practice a little under the stars. Perfectly normal behavior, not creepy at all. So there I was, sitting alone at a picnic table in the middle of the desert, clumsily plucking at the banjo while meteors streaked across the sky. After a while, though, I started getting that uneasy feeling you sometimes get when you're completely alone in a quiet place. My mind started racing. Was that a shadow moving? What if someone shows up out here? What if someone's been listening this whole time and suddenly starts singing back? This is the park with the burned car. What if whoever did that came back? The desert was silent except for the occasional wrong note from my banjo. Then I heard voices. Muffled murmurs coming from the brush. A few quick sounds, then rustling. My heart dropped into my stomach and the back of my neck went cold. There was no way this was going to be a normal interaction. I squinted into the darkness, trying to pick out shapes in the bushes as the sounds got closer. The voices sounded high-pitched. Children? At that moment, I was convinced the headline would read, "Park Ranger dies of heart attack, found 3 days later still clutching banjo." Then 3 coyotes burst out of the creosote bushes, yipping and bounding right past me like they owned the place. They barely even looked at me. That night, I learned 2 things. Coyotes in the desert don't bother being quiet, and that was the last time I ever tried to practice banjo out there alone. I was attending an archaeological field school where we spent 6 weeks living out of tents at about 7,500 feet in elevation. We were deep in the backcountry. The nearest paved road was nearly 10 miles away, so once night fell, it felt like we were completely alone in the wilderness. One night, I woke up to a strange sound right outside my tent. It was a heavy huffing, almost like snorting. At first I lay still, half asleep, trying to figure out if I had imagined it. Then whatever was out there bumped into the side of my tent, right where my head was. I froze for a moment, my mind racing. Without really thinking, I reacted on pure instinct and threw an upward punch through the tent wall. I definitely made contact with something. Whatever it was immediately backed off, and the noise disappeared into the darkness. The campsite sat on U.S. Forest Service grazing land, so there's a decent chance it was just a cow wandering around in the middle of the night. But it also could have been a mountain lion or a black bear. I never found out. I had absolutely no desire to unzip the tent and investigate. As flimsy as it was, I decided the thin layer of fabric between me and the outside world was safe enough. I've shared this story before, but it still gives me chills when I think about it. Back in the late 1970s, a friend and I were hiking on Mount Tamalpais in Northern California. It was a normal day on the trail, nothing unusual, just the two of us enjoying the hike. At one point, we came across a man standing near a rocky outcropping. There wasn't anything obviously threatening about him, but the moment we saw him, something felt off. The vibe he gave off was deeply unsettling. Neither of us said much at the time, but we didn't stick around. We kept moving and put some distance between ourselves and that spot as quickly as we reasonably could. A few years later, when the trailside killer was finally caught, his photo appeared in the newspaper. Both my friend and I recognized him immediately and independently from that encounter on the trail. Realizing who we had crossed paths with sent a chill down my spine. Looking back, I can't help thinking that if I had been hiking with my girlfriend that day instead of my buddy, things might have turned out very differently. A few years ago, my brother and I were camping in Colorado. Late one night, he woke me up after hearing a twig snap somewhere close to our tent. Out there, every little sound seems louder in the dark, so we both grabbed our headlamps and started scanning the trees around us. That's when we saw them, two large eyes reflecting back at us from the willows nearby. They were big, really big. My first thought was that it had to be a bear. Whatever it was just stood there, completely still, staring at us. We watched it for what felt like forever, probably 5 minutes, neither of us saying much while the tension slowly built. Eventually, we decided it would be smarter to move our camp closer to some other groups nearby, so we shut off our lights and started getting ready. The moment the lights went out, the willows exploded with movement. A massive moose burst out of the brush and charged straight toward us. For a split second, it looked like it was going to plow right through our tent, but at the last moment it veered off and thundered past us into the darkness. My heart was pounding for a long time after that. Another experience happened while I was hiking a trail I walk all the time with my dog. Usually there are other hikers around, but that day it had rained earlier and the trail was completely empty. My dog was about 20 yards ahead of me when she suddenly stopped. Without warning, she turned around and sprinted straight back down the trail, completely ignoring me calling her. That alone was strange enough, so I started jogging after her. As I ran, I glanced down at the muddy trail and saw it clearly. A fresh mountain lion track. My husband and I were hiking in a state park on the East Coast one weekday afternoon. It was the middle of the work week, so the trails were almost empty. In the 3 hours we spent out there, we only passed maybe 2 other people. Aside from that, the only sounds were our footsteps, our dog moving through the brush, and the occasional birds or small animals in the woods. Then, out of nowhere, I started hearing a faint chanting sound. At first, it was so subtle that I thought maybe I was imagining it. I asked my husband quietly if he could hear it too. He nodded, but immediately motioned for me to stay quiet. Our dog reacted at the same time. His ears shot straight up and the fur along his back stood on end. We kept walking, listening carefully. The faint chanting grew louder and clearer until it sounded like full-on monk chanting, deep and rhythmic. The best way I can describe it is like a Gregorian chant, almost exactly like the kind you hear in the Halo soundtrack. It was so clear it felt like a speaker was right next to us in the woods. Trying to calm myself down, I told myself it had to be something normal, maybe a group of teenagers hiding somewhere off the trail playing it on their phones as a joke. That explanation made sense in my head, but the sound felt way too powerful and close for that. After about 5 minutes, the chanting suddenly stopped. Just like that, gone. The woods went back to complete silence. Neither of us said much after that. We walked the remaining 3 miles back to the car mostly in silence, both of us a little on edge. Even now, thinking about it still gives me chills. My wife and I were hiking out of the Grand Canyon around 3 a.m. It was incredibly dark, the kind of darkness where your headlamp only lights a small circle in front of you and everything beyond it disappears into shadow. Aside from our lights, there was nothing but the night and the quiet of the canyon. Suddenly, a pack of dogs ran up toward us. We both froze, and they stopped too. In the beam of our headlamps, all I could see were glowing eyes staring back at us and the faint silhouettes of bushy tails moving in the darkness. For a moment, my heart was pounding. I had no idea what we were dealing with. After a few tense seconds, it clicked. These weren't wild animals. They were working dogs from the nearby reservation that sometimes roamed the area. Trying to keep things calm, I spoke to them in the same cheerful voice I use with my own dog and said, "Hey puppers." Almost immediately, the tension broke. The dogs lost interest and casually trotted off into the darkness like we were nothing special. In the end, it wasn't really dangerous at all, but in that moment, standing there in the pitch black surrounded by glowing eyes, I was just about ready to lose it. I was on a camping trip in the Boundary Waters in Minnesota when something happened that scared us half to death. In the middle of the night, we were suddenly jolted awake by an incredibly loud slap, followed by a splash coming from somewhere out on the lake. Sound travels really well over water, so it echoed across the whole area. Our first thought was pure panic. Half asleep and disoriented, we were convinced someone might be shooting at us. In that moment, lying there in the dark with no idea what was happening, it was absolutely terrifying. A little while later, we heard the sound again, another loud slap and splash, this time seeming closer to our campsite. That's when one of the guides suddenly realized what it actually was. It wasn't gunfire at all. It was a beaver smacking its tail against the water before diving under. Once we figured that out, the fear faded pretty quickly, but for those first few minutes, our imaginations had definitely run wild. I've had a few moments while hiking that were scary in very different ways. One of them happened while I was doing the Tongariro circuit in New Zealand, hiking between two huts. Part of the trail followed a long, barren ridge. It was near the end of the day, and I was exhausted, moving slower than I wanted to. I had plenty of water, food, and warm clothes, so I was safe, just tired. The Tongariro crossing itself is usually packed with people, but the circuit is much quieter. That evening there was no one else around at all. The trail markers stretched ahead of me across the ridge, one after another, seemingly endless. The landscape barely changed, and I just kept trudging forward, half joking to myself that maybe I'd somehow died and ended up in some kind of hiking purgatory. Another unsettling moment happened in southern British Columbia. A group of us had hiked up to a lookout and were heading back down. Everything had been normal on the way up. But when we reached a section of trail we had passed only 15 to 20 minutes earlier, we spotted fresh cougar scat right in the middle of the path. We were all healthy adults, no kids or dogs, so the odds of an attack were low, but definitely not zero. Knowing you're in cougar territory is one thing. Realizing there's probably a cougar nearby that could be watching you is something else entirely. The walk down that mountain had everyone on edge. The most disturbing experience, though, happened in the Glass House Mountains. I was hiking with a friend, just the two of us, both women. At the summit, we met a guy who started chatting with us. At first it seemed harmless, but it quickly got uncomfortable. He began making creepy comments about our bodies and weird remarks about two women traveling together. My friend suggested we start heading down. The guy casually said, "Cool, where are we going next?" I immediately told him to leave us alone and never speak to us again. When he started following us down the trail, we both began yelling at him until another hiker, a muscular guy, stepped in, and asked what was going on. We took that moment to get out of there quickly. Later that night, we were sitting quietly beside our tent when we heard someone asking our neighboring campsite if they'd seen his friends, 2 women. Our neighbor said no, and we quietly slipped into our tent without making a sound. The next day, we met a Swedish couple on another hike who told us a creepy guy had been going around their hostel the night before asking about 2 women. Apparently, he had been checking camps and hostels all over the area looking for us. Needless to say, that one stuck with me. Not all the scary moments were about people. One night in Maine, we were sitting around a campfire when we suddenly heard a huge crashing sound coming from the woods. We immediately bolted back to the van and peeked out through the windshield. Just in time, we saw a massive bull moose burst out of the trees, run straight through the campsite, and disappear back into the forest on the other side. Incredible to see, but definitely a little terrifying. And then there was the strangest experience in the Rocky Mountains. About halfway through a hike, we heard a loud, high-pitched scream in the distance. We thought it might be a cougar, but it sounded pretty far away, so we just stayed alert and kept moving. A few minutes later, one of my friends suddenly started laughing hysterically. I turned around, wondering what was so funny, but she actually looked pretty shaken. Then we realized something strange. Her laughter seemed to be echoing all around us. Then mine did too. Before long, all 4 of us were hearing our own voices bouncing back from the mountains, sounding like laughter coming from every direction. It was eerie enough that we started debating whether to turn back. We were on a quiet trail but knew it connected to a busier one ahead, so we pushed forward and joined the more popular route. Everything was fine after that, but we kept hearing that same scream in the distance, and whenever the trail went quiet with no other hikers nearby, faint echoes of laughter seemed to drift around us again. I used to work as a tree planter in northern Ontario, living in tents deep in the forest, sometimes hours from civilization, only reachable by logging roads. The isolation was part of the job, but it also meant strange and sometimes terrifying encounters. One of the weirdest stories I heard was from a fellow planter who came across a backpack in the middle of his planting area. Inside were shoes, clothes, a wallet with a school ID, and a film camera. How it ended up there was a complete mystery. This isn't exactly a place anyone would hike or camp. For me, the scariest moments were all about the wildlife. I once woke up to find my tent vestibule had been collapsed with a large bear claw tear right through it, and I apparently slept through the whole thing. Another time, I turned a corner on the trail and came face to face with a wolf just 10 feet away. One morning, I returned to a spot I'd planted only 5 minutes earlier and found fresh prints from a mother bear and her cubs. Realizing a bear family had walked right behind me while my back was turned was unsettling, to say the least. You really do not want to mess with a mama bear and her cubs. Canadian wildlife is intense, definitely not something to take lightly. At 3 a.m., the campsite was silent, with everyone completely knocked out in their tents. I was suddenly jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling my tent. Moments later, a distant, blood-curdling scream pierced the air. For the next half hour, I watched a flashlight beam wave frantically outside my tent walls. Though I considered investigating, the fear of the unknown kept me paralyzed in my sleeping bag. I didn't fall back asleep for hours. The following morning, the mystery unraveled. A bear cub had been scavenging through our site and stumbled upon my friend, who was sleeping in a hammock. The cub's curiosity led it to poke a claw through the fabric, slicing a deep gash into my friend's elbow. It turns out the mysterious light was my friend, who had spent 2 hours terrified and scanning the woods with his flashlight, fearing the mother bear was nearby. All of this high-stakes drama had unfolded a mere 6 feet away from me. Years ago, while working in a Southeast Asian rainforest, our nightly routine involved trapping moths. The setup was simple: a massive white sheet illuminated by a generator-powered lamp. It was a literal food chain in action. The light brought the bugs brought the frogs brought the snakes, and the snakes brought the predators. Because of the noise and glare, the trap was stationed a mile away from our base camp, leaving you completely isolated in the heart of the jungle at 3 a.m. One overcast night, during the agonizingly slow 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. shift, the silence was broken by a rustle in the nearby undergrowth. While forest noises were standard, this sounded significantly heavier than the usual scuttle of small game. As the crashing got closer, my adrenaline spiked. By the time the source was just feet away, I was genuinely convinced I was about to become a tiger's midnight snack. Suddenly, a ghastly, disembodied face erupted from the tree line, shrieking in a language I couldn't understand. I nearly jumped out of my skin, letting out a terrified yell of my own, only for the face to vanish back into the darkness, followed by a trail of high-pitched giggles. As my heart rate finally retreated from the danger zone, the pieces clicked together. One of the local lumberjacks had snuck up on me, using a flashlight pressed under his chin to create the perfect, spooky story, lighting for a jump scare. Honestly, once the terror faded, I wasn't even mad. It was a world-class prank. In the dead of night at our New Mexico campsite, a group of bears decided to wander in and make themselves at home. They were just chilling among our gear, their heavy breathing and rustling sounds cutting through the dark. Suddenly, a guy from a neighboring group, someone we didn't even know, decided he'd had enough. He stepped out of his tent, grabbed a random stick, and actually charged at them. He chased the bears right out of the sight, screaming at the top of his lungs the whole way. It was absolutely wild to witness. One afternoon, I was trail running near my house, completely zoned out with my headphones, and since I knew every inch of the path by heart. As I rounded a familiar bend, I suddenly locked eyes with a decaying deer carcass through a gap in the trees just 20 feet ahead. Something about the way it was slumped made it look as if the rotting corpse was staring right through my soul. Panic hit me instantly. I spun on my heels and bolted back the way I came as fast as my legs could carry me. Living in a beach community near a maritime forest, I was out hiking about 40 years ago when I stumbled upon a truly bizarre sight: a massive sea turtle hanging by its neck from a tree. The shell had to be at least 4 feet across. I figured someone had rigged it up that way, hoping to collect the shell once the flesh rotted away, though I highly doubted the neck would hold the weight for that long. It was definitely one of the weirder things I've ever encountered in the woods. About 8 years ago, I was hiking a stretch of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia. Our group had naturally thinned out based on pace, and I found myself in the middle of the pack. When a few people stopped to deal with a tick, I decided to press on alone to catch up with the lead group. The ad is famously well marked with white blazes, so I wasn't at all concerned about losing my way. I knew the next landmark was an old logging road, and I hit it about half a mile later. While waiting for the others to catch up, I took a detour down the overgrown road, which ran perpendicular to the main trail. I was strolling along an old stone wall, casually looking for artifacts, when I suddenly crossed an invisible threshold. The change was instantaneous. The sound simply cut off. 1 second the woods were alive with birdsong and rustling leaves. The next, there was a deafening, unnatural silence. I took a few more hesitant steps, and that's when I hit a wall of pure atmospheric pressure. It was an overwhelming sense of being unwelcome, like walking into the home of someone who despised you, but amplified 100 times over. Every hair on my body stood on end. I froze. Even though I couldn't see anything threatening down the road, the primal urge to leave was absolute. I knew with total certainty that I wasn't supposed to be there, and that staying would be a mistake. I began to back away slowly, refusing to turn my back or even blink until I crossed that invisible line again. Suddenly, the birds were singing and the wind was back in the trees. I didn't truly relax until I heard my group leader catch up and ask if I'd found anything interesting down the road. I just shook my head and said, "Nope, let's keep moving." Looking back, I tell myself it was probably a predator like a cougar or a bear watching me from the shadows, but in that moment, the experience felt chillingly paranormal. Years ago, I was hiking a lakeside loop in the Adirondacks with my ex-boyfriend. It was early spring, so the trails were still rugged and unmaintained. We were about halfway to a waterfall when the silence was shattered by a heavy thumping sound, like a large animal stomping the earth as it charged toward us. Then came a bizarre, rapidly accelerating growl, a sound so mechanical and strange it belonged in a Hollywood alien movie. I didn't wait around. I bolted. My boyfriend was shouting for me to hold up, but I was absolutely terrified. I was so winded and shaken that I flat out refused to head back the way we came. Instead, we ended up trudging through a thick, freezing bog that nearly sucked the boots right off our feet just to reach the other side of the loop. By the time we hit the car, I was in tears. Between the scare and the fact that I'd spent the previous day sick from food poisoning, I was done. I moped the whole way home, declaring that our next vacation would be to a city. We had spent 4 consecutive trips in the Adirondacks, and that experience finally broke me. Fast forward years later, I was listening to nature sounds online when I suddenly heard that exact growl. A genuine chill, the kind you usually only read about, ran straight up my spine. As it turns out, that terrifying, otherworldly noise was just the mating call of a ruffed grouse beating its wings against its chest. So yeah, I effectively traumatized myself and hiked through a swamp because of a horny bird. While not technically a park, we were camping on a remote beach within an indigenous reserve in northern Australia, traveling with special permits. When we woke the next morning, we discovered massive footprints and a heavy-tailed drag mark where a saltwater crocodile had cruised right past our tent under the cover of darkness. Scanning the water, we spotted a croc on the far side of the bay, presumably the same one, that had to be at least 6 meters long. We didn't stick around to introduce ourselves. We packed up and moved camp immediately. We were stuck in an Australian national park at night, completely cut off with no cell signal, when we found ourselves surrounded by a group of meth users. They intercepted us at the park gate, blocking our car. About 5 of them piled out and swarmed the vehicle, leaning in to ask if we knew where they could score any drugs. I sat there with my large Becker BK knife gripped at my side, ready for the worst. Fortunately, they eventually backed off and let us pass. I was working as a camp hand alongside a Navajo coworker my age, tasked with tending to horses, cooking, and maintaining the site. Our setup included a trailer equipped with emergency rifles and 2 guard dogs. One evening, after a long trail ride, we returned to find a lone coyote patrolling the camp. It scurried off once it spotted us, but my friend and I were left with an unshakable, sinking feeling. While the other workers brushed it off, we couldn't shake the sensation of being watched for the rest of the night. In the early hours of the morning, we were jolted awake by frantic banging on the trailer door and a chilling wail echoing from outside. My friend checked the blinds and realized it was the campers, terrified and seeking refuge. Once inside, they explained that one girl had heard what sounded like her friend crying out in pain outside the tent. When she got up to help, she actually stepped on her friend, who was still safely asleep inside, realizing the voice was coming from the darkness. That wailing had continued for 20 minutes before they bolted for our trailer. As they spoke, the sound vanished, only to erupt again much closer to the site. Our dogs were bristling, their low growls signaling real danger. Gripped by fear, my friend and I grabbed the rifles, took the dogs, and stepped out into the center of the camp. The sound was coming from the pitch-black woods just beyond the perimeter. We frantically threw wood onto the embers of the campfire to light up the area, and that's when things turned surreal. As the fire roared to life, a chorus of wailing broke out from every direction. The dogs stood their ground, growling fiercely. Terrified, I chambered a round into my rifle, and my friend did the same. Suddenly, the woods went deathly silent. Then, out of the darkness to my left, I heard my own name being called. I was so paralyzed with fear that I actually lost control of my bladder. My friend was pale, his eyes darting toward the source of the voice. In a moment of desperation, he grabbed a burning branch from the fire and hurled it toward the spot. Something hissed and scurried away, sending the dogs into a barking frenzy. My friend then spotted a shape moving slowly toward us. He leveled his rifle and fired, hitting the target. Driven by pure adrenaline and terror, we both began firing into the brush at every snap and rustle we heard. We stayed outside, clutching our rifles until the sun came up and the rest of the staff arrived. After we explained the night's chaos, they went to investigate the tree. They eventually returned with the bodies of 2 coyotes. It turns out the campers had brought a large supply of meat and failed to seal the containers, attracting a whole pack. My mind had raced through every nightmare from skinwalkers to ghosts, but seeing the physical creatures that had mimicked those sounds was, in its own way, just as haunting. My most surreal experience occurred during an off-trail hike in the Colorado Rockies. I was struggling with severe depression and had escaped into the mountains to get a day away from an awful ex. I didn't have much of a plan, and at one point, I fell through the ice into a shallow stream. Soaked and frustrated, I just said fuck it and refused to head back to the car. As I neared the crest of a steep hill, I nearly stepped on a large leg bone. My initial thought was, oh, that's cool, until I looked 3 feet further and saw several more limb bones and most of a spine scattered between 2 mounds. There was no fresh blood, but it was clear I had wandered into the regular feeding grounds of something that could easily ruin me. I froze, scanned the silent woods, and decided to snap a few photos before slowly retreating back down the hill. Halfway down, I stopped. I figured I was overthinking things, and the prospect of going home was so unappealing that I turned back around to head up again. I had only taken about 5 steps when I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy animal pacing around at the top of the hill. I didn't stick around to see what it was. In my frantic hurry to get out of there, I managed to slip into the water one more time. In January, I was working at a remote microwave radio site on a mountaintop near Prince Rupert, British Columbia. The snowdrifts were so deep that the road was impassable even for a snowcat, so I had to be dropped off by helicopter in the morning and picked up at the end of the day. The site was just a small, windowless, 30 by 40-foot building with a single metal front door. I was puttering away inside with some music playing, not making much noise, when I heard a distinct knock at the door. I thought it was strange that anyone else would be up there, but I went to answer it. There was nobody there. I stepped outside and scanned the area. No tracks, no footprints, nothing. I figured some falling ice might have hit the building, so I went back to work. A few minutes later, the knocking returned, longer and more deliberate this time. Again, I opened the door to find an empty landscape. I went back inside, only for a third round of knocking to start a minute later. This time, it sounded like someone was angrily pounding to be let in. I grabbed a crowbar and threw the door open, certain I'd catch someone, but once again, the porch was empty. Standing there in the silence, I felt like I was being watched. I peered into the surrounding brush, but saw nothing. Something finally compelled me to look up and behind me. There, perched on the edge of the roof directly above the door, was a raven. It met my gaze with what looked like pure amusement, let out a mocking rock, 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 and flapped off toward the tree-line. Asshole. I was hiking alone on a remote, 10-mile trail in Colorado during the dead of winter. It was a path rarely traveled, and I hadn't seen another soul the entire day. Being a 300-pound man who frequented the area, I felt perfectly comfortable being out there by myself. About halfway through the woods, I absent-mindedly started whistling to myself. To my shock, someone whistled back. Based on the volume, they couldn't have been more than 200 feet away. I don't hike anymore. I was hiking up a local mountain, heading toward a cliff face for a day of climbing, when my partner suddenly pointed off to the side. "What do you think that is?" they asked. I looked over and saw nothing but a dense, moving blackness heading straight for the trail we were on. Instantly, I was overcome by a sense of pure, primal terror. Without a second thought, I turned and bolted back down the path. Later, I found out that a murder had occurred only about half a mile from our location, right around the same time we saw it. The scariest moment I've had was deep in the backcountry of the Canadian Rockies. My friend and I were about a 2-hour hike in, each of us with a dog on a leash, when the silence was shattered. From all around us, and so close it made me jump, at least 4 wolves began to howl in unison. While it was an incredible thing to experience, I was definitely on edge about the safety of our dogs. We never actually laid eyes on the pack, but as we hiked back out a few hours later, they howled once more, though thankfully from a much greater distance. Not long ago, I stumbled across a deer leg while out on a trail near my house. It hadn't begun to decompose yet, so I knew the kill was fresh, but there wasn't another trace of the animal anywhere in sight. Knowing that coyotes and cougars frequent the area, I kept my dogs on a short leash and headed straight back home. Another time, I was forced to cut a hike short as thunder and lightning began rolling in. I had been off trail taking photos of a river and had to crawl through some thick brush to get back to the path. As I pushed through the last of the branches, I found myself face to face with a massive bull moose. I knew they were big, but seeing one that close was a holy shit moment. We locked eyes for a solid minute, neither of us moving. I kept my hand on a nearby climbable tree the entire time, ready to scramble up if he decided to charge. Eventually, he just went back to grazing and meandered down the trail at his own pace. I really wish I could have snapped a few photos, but the rain was starting to pour and I didn't want to risk ruining my camera or provoking a giant. I didn't see what happened, but I certainly heard it. Living in the middle of nowhere in Arizona, I'm surrounded by vast stretches of empty land. One day, I was just about to take my dog for a walk in a massive open field when the silence was shattered by a woman screaming for her life. Suddenly, the screaming stopped, and a man let out an incredibly loud, deranged laugh. I immediately decided that this was a situation for the police, not me. I called them, and once they arrived, I explained exactly what I had heard. They went out to investigate while I headed back home. My dog had to settle for a very short walk that day, and I haven't taken that path since. I still have no idea what actually happened out there. When I was 9, my family went camping in a state park in southern Minnesota. It was late at night, and as we were getting ready for bed, I found myself staring intently into the darkness, mostly because I've always been absolutely terrified of it. Suddenly, I saw a shadow roughly the size of a crawling 4-year-old dart into the bushes just 10 feet away from me. It scared the life out of me, and it took over an hour for me to finally drift off. I was jumping at every tiny snap and rustle in the woods. To this day, I am still not happy about it. I used to do a massive amount of camping, but one night early on changed things for me. I was out with 2 friends in the middle of the night, hanging out in a field near our campsite to look at the stars. The moon was nearly full and so bright it felt almost like daytime. Suddenly, I caught the sound of a faint whisper. I initially assumed it was someone from our camp, but the sound was coming from the opposite direction. We all went silent to listen, and a faint, thin hi-yi drifted toward us. We followed the sound across the field, away from the safety of the site. As we walked, the whispering grew only slightly louder until we reached a road. On the other side sat a dilapidated, easily crossed fence that bordered a small patch of woods. Even with the moon lighting up the field, the interior of those woods was absolute pitch black. The trees were spaced far apart, yet you couldn't see past the first few rows. Now, the voice was much clearer, though it remained a hushed whisper. It sounded exactly like a little girl. "Come play," it called out. There were no women or children on this trip, just us. Hearing a little girl inviting us into the total darkness to play at 1 in the morning was enough for us. We decided right then not to investigate any further. I was camping with my Boy Scout troop when I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by the sound of heavy footsteps and deep breathing just outside the tent. The noise grew louder as more rhythmic stomping joined in. By this point, my bunkmates were awake too, frozen as we listened to intense huffing and strange animal grunts. It felt like we were being surrounded, but as it turned out, our campsite was situated right in the middle of an active cattle crossing. There had to be at least 30 cows parading past us all at once. Waking up to a chorus of animal noises and 1,000 footsteps in the dark was a heart-pounding experience, to say the least. The next morning confirmed it. There were fresh cow pies everywhere. About 20 years ago, I was in Big Bend National Park prepping for a backpacking presentation for REI. It's a gorgeous landscape in West Texas where the high desert meets the mountains along the Rio Grande. I was hiking near Santa Elena Canyon a few hours before sunset, hoping to snag some photos where the river basin flattens out and the wildlife tends to gather. I was several hundred meters from my van when I saw something truly bizarre moving on the far side of the river. It was large, man-sized, but hugged low to the ground. My brain struggled to process the image. At first, it looked like a deer lying on its side, shuffling along like a snake. I shifted my position to get a better line of sight, and the puzzle finally snapped into place. It was a mountain lion, a massive cat. It was creeping along, dead set on hunting something that couldn't have been more than a stone's throw from where I stood. I had never seen one in the wild before, and the moment I realized what I was looking at, my blood turned to ice. Then, it looked at me. I'll never forget that stare. You could almost see the calorie calculator clicking behind its eyes. I have never been more thankful for a river. Even though the water was low due to drought and irrigation, it still felt like a formidable barrier. The cat began doing double takes, its head whipping back and forth between me and its original prey, weighing the risk versus the reward of this evening's menu. Dying a little inside, I kept my eyes on it and began a slow, quiet retreat. Whether the river was too much of an X factor or I just wasn't worth the effort, the lion didn't give chase. I broke line of sight and made it back to the van with nothing but a case of mild tachycardia. It was the longest short walk of my life. Later that night, I parked off the main road in an area known for predators. I sat there in the middle of nowhere, munching on stale Oreos and sipping water, listening to the occasional growl or feline scream pierce the darkness. I felt incredibly lucky to be where I was on the food chain. Of course, there was also the night I took NyQuil for a respiratory illness and, thanks to a frequent side effect, hallucinated vividly. I woke up screaming at a mountain at 3 a.m. in the middle of a public campsite. But that's probably someone else's scary camping story. During a family vacation a couple of summers ago, my 16-year-old cousin and I decided to wander slightly off trail while exploring the Grand Canyon. I was about 13 at the time. As we were walking, something caught my peripheral vision and stopped me cold. Propped up against a tree and held in place by a few rocks was a creepy, stuffed rabbit. There was something about the way it was positioned that felt completely wrong. We didn't stick around to investigate. We just got out of there immediately. Even now, at 15, thinking about that doll sitting out there in the middle of nowhere still weirds me out. I was heading out to a familiar shooting spot in a national forest with my two brothers, an old quarry tucked several miles up a logging road. Every time we'd visited in the past, the place had been deserted, save for some scattered trash and old shell casings. This time was different. As we rounded the corner into the quarry, we were met with a makeshift settlement, a dozen or so rusted, dilapidated RVs and several large tents arranged in a wide circle. At the far end, positioned against the tallest rock face, sat a portable stage. At the center of the stage stood a massive, charred piece of wood that might have once been a cross, though it was so badly burned it was hard to tell for sure. Even though my brothers and I were each carrying handguns and had a literal arsenal in the back of the SUV, we didn't feel an ounce of comfort. I immediately began whipping the car around to get us out of there. Before I could finish the turn, a small child emerged from one of the tents and approached the vehicle. Against my better judgment, I cracked the window. "My dad says nobody should be here," the kid said. "We're just leaving." I managed to get out. The second the words left my mouth, a gravelly, slurred voice roared from inside the tent. "I told you not to talk to the cops." I drove back to the highway far faster than I should have. Needless to say, we haven't been back to that spot since. I live near the ghost town of Elvira, Pennsylvania. During World War II, the government used eminent domain to evict the residents and build a munitions factory. Today, the land is a patchwork of state game lands, a federal prison, and restricted government plots. The game lands are scattered with bunkers, concrete, igloo-like structures once used for explosives, now overgrown with earth and used by locals as party spots. Growing up, there were always rumors of devil worshippers performing rituals in the more isolated bunkers. I never bought into it. Every town has a story like that, until a close friend of mine, a total straight shooter, told me his parents had stumbled upon a group in robes chanting around a fire with a figure in a deer head mask. He claimed he'd heard the same chanting himself while hunting with his father. My own experience happened during a high school summer all-nighter. 5 of us were out in the woods behind my house, which connects directly to the game lands, playing manhunt and messing around with airsoft guns. Deep in the trees, we spotted an orange glow where I knew no houses existed. My friend started joking about the cultists to freak us out, and I played along, leading a quest toward the light. As we bushwhacked through the dark, far from the house, the neighbor's dog began barking hysterically. Suddenly, it let out a horrifying, unnatural shriek and went dead silent. I saw the dog later, so I know it survived, but the sound was chilling. We froze. From just beyond the reach of our flashlights, we heard distinct, heavy, bipedal footsteps. Crunch. 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 It wasn't a deer or a squirrel. It was something walking on 2 legs. Terrified, we retreated to the guest apartment above my garage. It's a separate building with an old 70s-style accordion door halfway up the stairs. Well after midnight, as we were finally starting to doze off, we heard something brushing against that flimsy plastic door from the other side. We could see the door vibrating as something bumped it. "Does anyone else hear that?" I whispered. I got a few shaky yes from the darkroom. When I asked if anyone was going to check it, the answer was a unanimous no. I certainly wasn't going down there either. Eventually, the scratching stopped, and somehow, we managed to fall asleep. My cousin Steve is a seasoned outdoorsman, but there's one story he tells, dating back to the autumn of 2004, that he's dead serious about. He was camping alone in a remote, forested wilderness, set up in a small clearing no larger than a living room. The first night was uneventful. However, the following afternoon, Steve experienced a bizarre sensation of being on autopilot. He felt magnetically drawn toward a specific spot in the trees. Just 25 feet from his camp, he stumbled upon a rectangular stone slab lying in the dirt. It looked like a toppled headstone, but it was strangely polished and reflective, with no writing or moss on it. Despite sitting under the canopy, not a single leaf or twig rested on its surface. It looked brand new, yet completely out of place. As he stared at it, A wave of total disorientation washed over him. Even though he could see the red fabric of his tent just a few yards away, he felt as if he'd been plucked off the map and dropped into a completely alien landscape. Then, two things happened in rapid succession. First, a wave of ice-cold air hit him, a winter chill in the middle of a warm autumn afternoon, yet not a single leaf or branch stirred. Second, a deafening crack, like a single, massive handclap, echoed through the entire valley. In the blink of an eye, the sun was gone. 1 second it was 3:30 p.m., the next it was 8 p.m., and the woods were draped in twilight. The polished stone was nowhere to be seen. Terrified and missing several hours of his life, Steve scrambled back to his tent. It was too dark to hike out through the wilderness, so he was forced to hunker down until morning. He barely slept. All night long, he heard a heavy, rhythmic snoring sound just outside the thin walls of his tent. He tried to convince himself it was a bear or a mountain lion, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. As soon as the sun was fully up, he tore down his camp and hauled ass back to civilization. He hasn't been back to those woods since. About a year and a half ago, during the massive forest fires in the Columbia River Gorge, my friend and I did something admittedly reckless. With the Oregon side of the gorge completely ablaze, we decided to hike up one of our favorite peaks on the Washington side to watch the flames after dark. We trekked up the trail as the sun dipped below the horizon, eventually finding ourselves in total darkness, guided only by the narrow beams of our headlamps. Out of nowhere, the silence was shattered by a bone-chilling screech. It was incredibly loud, likely an elk, and sounded no more than 10 or 15 yards away. We had no idea anything was there until it let out that piercing cry and tore off into the thick brush. We stood there for a second, heart rate spiking, before looking at each other in confusion and laughing off the adrenaline. It was a hell of a jump scare, but honestly, the most frightening part of the night was watching one of Oregon's most beautiful forests turn into a wall of fire across the water. It happened at dusk. I caught sight of a massive, humanoid silhouette, broad-shouldered with a distinct round head and no snout, tearing through the foliage at an impossible speed. The noise was deafening, branches swinging wildly and heavy sticks snapping under its weight as it moved. Even though it wasn't heading directly toward me, every survival instinct I had screamed at once. I was so gripped by terror that I didn't even try to start my ATV. I just bolted on foot, leaving the machine behind in the dirt. I had to come back later with a group of people just to gather the courage to retrieve it. I never saw the figure again, and to this day, I have no idea what it was. As a park ranger, I've seen my fair share of oddities, but one experience stands out from my time at a national wildlife refuge that used to be a U.S. Army research and development site. Before it opened to the public in the early 2000s, the land required a decade of cleanup to remove old military hazards like barbed wire barricades. In the refuge system, visitors are strictly forbidden from leaving the trails, but my job often requires me to venture deep into the brush. On one particular day, I was a considerable distance from any marked path when I spotted a group of figures in the distance. My stomach dropped. I immediately worried they were armed hunters, so I froze and watched. They didn't move. I eventually announced myself and cautiously approached the group. What I found were 6 badly charred mannequins dressed in military uniforms, just standing there in the middle of the woods. Stumbling upon them alone was unsettling, and the sight sent shivers down my spine. I later dug into the site's history and discovered they were leftovers from flame-retardant fabric tests conducted decades ago. Go figure. That's just the tip of the iceberg, though. I've also stumbled across a person half-eaten by coyotes and once had to bust up a particularly rowdy crackhead party on the 4th of July. In 2005, a friend and I were walking through a small woodland in Dorset. It was snowing, and at one point my friend, who was a bit on the heavier side, slipped and fell into a muddy stream while trying to jump over it. It was hilarious at the time. We had been hiking for a couple of hours when we noticed something strange on a tree ahead. As we approached, we realized it was the head of a deer. It had been impaled on a small, protruding branch that had entered through the neck and exited through the eye. I was chilling around a campfire at my friend's house out in the country. His property butts right up against the woods, and it was a perfectly quiet night. We were all zoned out, staring into the flames, when these absolutely horrifying screams erupted from the trees. It sounded like it was less than 50 yards away, the sound of an animal, maybe a dog, being eaten alive. There was yelping and agonizing cries of pain over and over again. The screaming lasted for a solid 60 seconds before it just stopped, leaving a piercing silence behind. Something definitely died in the woods that night. I don't know what it was or what killed it, but I can still hear those screams in my head. We called it a night and went straight inside after that. I wasn't hiking, but I was fishing at a pond on my grandparents' property in West Virginia. The spot is about a quarter mile down a hill from the house, just barely within sight, and is bordered by an open field on one side and thick forest on the others. I was sitting on the right side of the small dock, and after about 2 hours of near silence, I heard something rustling in the woods to my left. I smiled and joked to myself, "Oh, it's probably a bear." When I looked over, I realized I was right, but I had the count wrong. There were 3 of them, a mama and 2 cubs, walking along the edge of the pond directly toward me. They were only about 20 feet away. Panic started to set in as I thought, this might be a good day to die. I froze, trying to remember my options. I knew running was a mistake, and that you can usually scare off a black bear by being loud and looking large. However, I also knew that if cubs are involved, those rules often go out the window and things can get ugly fast. As they got closer, I decided I'd rather try to scare them off while they were 20 feet away instead of 2. With my back still to them, I slowly began to stand up. Halfway through the motion, I heard the sound of them running. Nearly terrified out of my skin, I spun around. All 3 bears were bolting back into the woods. I stood there for a minute, completely on edge, before I started walking, then sprinting, back to the house. I was laughing maniacally and audibly thanking God that I hadn't died that day. When I reached my family on the porch, I made sure to tell them in a very specific order. First, that I caught 4 14-inch fish, and then, oh yeah, I saw a bear. I'm just a regular guy, not a ranger or anything. But one time, a friend and I saw a woman with jet black hair and extremely pale skin standing quite a ways into the woods. She was just standing there, completely motionless. It almost looked like she had a faint glow radiating around her. I know it sounds totally fabricated, like something straight out of a horror movie, but I swear it's the truth. It gave me the most intense, chilling sensation I've ever felt. We both just turned and hauled it out of there immediately. Out back on my 30-acre property, there is a large grove of eucalyptus trees. I was walking through them with my friends, heading toward the river to drink some beer and hang out. I've passed these trees 1,000 times before without anything strange happening, but this time, I thought I saw a child peeking out from behind one of the larger trunks. I turned to my friends and asked, "Look right there. Is that a kid or what?" A humanoid figure, about 4 feet tall, peeked out from the shadows. It was a pale, grayish-white color with a strangely shaped head. That's about as descriptive as I can get, because the second I saw it, the hair on my arm stood up and I bolted. I ran as fast as I could back to the house to grab my gun. We still head down to the river sometimes, but we never pass those trees without being armed. I honestly wish I hadn't been so terrified in the moment. I feel like I should have stayed to film it. I've been to the Amazon twice, staying at Sani Lodge, a place run by the local community that is deep in the jungle. It is the kind of isolated where the nearest hospital is a helicopter ride away and you're strictly warned never to leave your cabin at night. The cabins have thatched roofs and large, glassless windows with only bug screens, so you hear every sound of the jungle as if you're sleeping outside. Over my 2 trips, I've gathered some chilling stories. One of our guides told us about getting stuck in the jungle after dark as a kid. Under the canopy, it is so pitch black that your eyes never adjust. It's impossible to move. He had to curl up between the roots of a massive tree and wait for dawn. He mentioned that you can signal for help by thumping the roots to create a deep vibration, but you have to use a specific rhythm. Doing it wrong at night is dangerous because jaguars use similar low-frequency sounds to communicate, and you definitely don't want to attract one. Speaking of jaguars, our trip organizer once climbed a canopy tower, a platform hundreds of feet up a skyscraper-sized tree, to survey owls at night. While sitting in the dark, they suddenly smelled the rancid, pungent scent of cat urine. When they switched on their lights, a jaguar was silently pulling itself onto the platform with them. It bolted when the light hit it, but it was a terrifying reminder that they can climb the massive, tree-sized vines that hang from the canopy. My own nights were just as eerie. I was usually so exhausted from hiking that I'd sleep through almost anything, including the time my roommate had to deal with a tarantula in our room while I was dead to the world. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, paralyzed by a sudden, primal terror. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I managed to whisper to my roommate to see if she was awake. She said she was. After I drifted back to sleep, she told me the next morning that she heard something heavy sniffing at our cabin door. The frogs were the strangest part. The local giant bullfrogs can grow over a foot long, and their calls are incredibly deep. From a distance, they sound exactly like a group of men having a hushed, bassy conversation. I'd often wake up thinking people were talking outside, only to realize it was 3 a.m. and there wasn't a soul around. One rainy night, I heard a rhythmic thumping on the wooden boardwalk outside my cabin. It sounded exactly like slow, deliberate footsteps approaching my door. I froze as the steps got closer and closer, eventually stopping right outside. I managed to fall back asleep, but when I asked the guide about it the next morning, he just gave a knowing nod. The bullfrogs, he said, use the boardwalks when it rains. I was on a 50-mile hike with a large group of friends, and we had naturally drifted into 3 separate clusters. 2 of my friends were about 5 minutes ahead of us. My group of 5 was in the middle, and the remaining 7 were trailing 5 to 10 minutes behind. We were hiking through the snow-capped mountains of the Pacific Northwest, so we were prepared for wildlife and carried bear spray just in case. When my group reached a snowy patch of the trail, we were immediately struck by a set of massive cougar tracks. The paw prints were nearly the size of my hand, and since I'm a big guy, that's no small measurement. It was fascinating but definitely unnerving to see evidence of such a large predator so close by. The truly terrifying realization came later when we spoke to the two friends who were only 5 minutes ahead of us. They had been watching the ground closely and reported seeing absolutely no tracks in that snow. That meant a massive cougar had stepped onto the trail in the narrow 5-minute window between their passing and our arrival. About 10 years ago, I was in my bathroom getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth with the window cracked open. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a woman screaming, "Oh my God! Oh my God! Somebody help! Please, somebody help me!" I froze for a few seconds, paralyzed by the sound, before leaning out the window and shouting, "Hello? Are you okay? Hello?" Only silence followed. I ran into the living room and told my husband to call 911, explaining that I'd just heard a woman screaming for her life in our backyard. A short while later, I heard sirens and saw emergency lights nearby, but I never heard another word about it. I have no idea what actually happened that night, but I still think about it all the time. Last year, I spent 2 months in the Wind River Range of Wyoming with a leadership training group. On the morning of our second day, nature called. Being a devout follower of leave no trace principles, I grabbed my trowel and bear spray and hiked out to find a spot at least 100 feet away from all water sources, trails, and camp. After walking what I thought was 100 feet, I realized my group was still in plain view through the thin foliage, so I pushed deeper into the woods for privacy. About 100 yards out, I found a secluded spot and tried to dig a cat hole, but the ground was nothing but solid rock. I decided to head back toward camp to find softer soil, but within minutes, I realized I didn't recognize any of the landmarks. I had gotten turned around. I didn't panic yet. I gave our group's established shout signal, expecting a chorus of replies. Instead, I was met with the deafening silence of the wilderness. At that point, I should have sat down to collect myself. Instead, I made a massive mistake. I tried to backtrack to find my bearings, only to realize I was truly, hopelessly lost. I had no sense of direction and began to spiral. Panic took over, and I started a frantic, tearful jog in whatever direction I was facing. This went on for nearly 7 hours. Exhausted, I finally collapsed in a marshy area filled with reeds. The silence was eventually broken by the sound of rustling brush and footsteps. I stood up and spotted the upper half of a trail runner who had wandered off trail. I sprinted toward him, shouting until I got his attention. When I explained my situation and where my campsite was, he just stared at me in disbelief. "Are you sure that's where you were?" he asked. I was certain, but he couldn't believe it. I had ended up nearly 10 miles away from my group, completely alone in one of the most vast wilderness expanses in the continental US. He guided me back to the main trail and pointed me toward camp. When I finally arrived, my instructors were overwhelmed with relief. They were 30 minutes away from launching a full-scale search and rescue operation and had to quickly get on the satellite phone to call it off. It was the scariest day of my life. I hate to imagine what would have happened if that runner hadn't chosen that specific marshland out of hundreds of square miles of terrain. To that stranger, thank you. One night, 3 of my friends and I decided to go biking on a trail that had already been closed for the night. We were heading to this hidden lake we all knew about. The last time we'd been there, the path was rough, but when we got close we realized they had recently paved the trail all the way to it, which was a nice surprise. The place was incredibly quiet. The only sounds were frogs croaking and the wind moving through the trees. As we rode across a new bridge that crossed a stream near the edge of the lake, I suddenly started hearing laughter. I looked over at my friends, and they heard it too. I asked them what the hell was going on, but none of them had any idea. Then, all at once, it felt like the entire forest got louder. The laughter grew louder, and the frogs suddenly sounded deafening, like there were thousands of them croaking all around us. The noise was overwhelming, and we all panicked and started speeding away on our bikes. At one point, we were heading uphill the same way we'd come in when something really strange happened. It felt like someone suddenly lifted the back tire of my bike and flipped it out from under me. I jumped back up immediately and looked around, but there was no one there. Even so, it still felt like I was being chased. I jumped back on the bike, kicked it into third gear, and pedaled up that hill as hard as I possibly could. The laughter slowly faded after about half a mile, but I didn't stop riding until we finally reached the end of the trail, about 5 miles later. I eventually caught up with my friends near the end. They were already freaking out because they hadn't realized I had fallen behind until a few minutes earlier. I've gone back to that lake since then, but never at night. These days it's actually a pretty popular spot, but that night still gives me chills when I think about it. Years ago, I lived in Durango, Colorado, in the Four Corners area. I was home with a few friends and my dog, Primus, a Rhodesian Ridgeback and Pit Bull mix who was truly the sweetest, most social dog I've ever known. One night, an acquaintance of my then boyfriend stopped by, and Primus underwent a terrifying transformation. He wouldn't let the man pass the entryway. He was in a full attack stance, teeth bared and hackles raised. It was a side of him I had never seen. One of my friends, who is Native American, looked visibly shaken and deeply uneasy. Sensing the tension, I told the visitor my boyfriend wasn't home and suggested he leave. The man stood there silently for a full minute, staring at us, and only turned to leave after Primus lunged forward with a snarl. As soon as the door closed, my Native American friend ran to the bathroom and vomited until he was dry heaving. When he finally emerged, shaking and miserable, he whispered, "Skinwalker." That's a skinwalker. I had him lie down in the spare room while Primus planted himself by my side, staring at the front door for hours, his hair bristling at every tiny sound. When my boyfriend finally returned, Primus wouldn't even let him near the rest of us. He spent an hour intensely sniffing him up and down before finally allowing him to sit on the couch. None of us ever saw that acquaintance again. By the next day, both Primus and my friend were back to their normal selves, but the experience still spooks me to this day.